And we're live. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, extraterrestrials, hobbits, and cryptids, to a special episode of the Fall Channel. So, tonight, the subject of our discussion will be something a little different than what I'm used to discussing, somewhat a little bit outside of my normal purview, but nevertheless, I hope you guys find it somewhat interesting. So, there's been a lot of things come out, and I'm probably not saying anything that somebody hasn't already mentioned, um, but I haven't said it. So I'll go ahead and discuss some of my thoughts or offer some of my thoughts on the superhero genre as well as these two new projects that have been put on the market by Marvel and DC. So before I begin too heavily much, I've never really been a superhero person. I mean, superheroes kind of faded out for me when I was younger. Um, but again, then again, I was growing up where the Marvel films were basically Spider-Man movies that Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man movies, and then I wasn't really a big X-Men film guy. I mean, I'd watch them, but they weren't like something that would be great. But hey, DJ Play Nice, definitely appreciate the interaction. Take it easy. But yeah, so superheroes haven't been always a thing for me. I mean, I did love at one point when I was a really, really small child. I did enjoy watching um, the old Batman films. Now we're talking. Now I hate to say this, the films I grew up watching as Batman was not the Michael Keaton Batman stuff. The things I actually grew up watching were things like, I mean, I hate to say it, it was George Clooney and Val Kilmer Superman, or sorry, Batman. There was no Superman in the '90s, as far as I recall, and I might get a lot of this inaccurate. So anybody who wants to point that out to me, definitely do that. So, I mean, I didn't watch the Michael Keaton Batman stuff until I was a little bit older, maybe well into the 2000s. But in general, like I always thought that the idea of the Tim Burton stuff and even the stuff I was growing up with as a kid was a little more on the campy side. I mean, I want to say that when I was a kid, I thought the idea of like a Batman credit card was a little over the top. And then that movie, just goes off the rails in many ways. But there's elements of it that I'm still nostalgic for. I mean, for those two films, I mean, some of the music is still kind of things I listen to. I mean, Kiss from a Rose is definitely always going to be a thing that sticks out to me when I remember the Batman of the '90s. So there is that. Um, but I mean, aside from that, DC movies were, you know, not a thing really, and then the ones that had been released were kind of hit and miss, or even just straight flops. And so there was that, and then the Marvel film stuff. I mean, there was no Marvel Studios when I was growing up, and so it would come out. Whoever owned the rights to a specific uh, Marvel IP, they would end up producing the film. So that's where you end up with the X-Men films, Spider-Man films, and then when Disney acquired it in 2008. So this is me, high school era, and we're going into a point in time where you know cinematic universes are not a thing. Even the attempt of doing such a thing is seen as crazy. And then once it, you know, they find a rhythm, they find a formula, that then and then the other studios get the smell of blood in the water, or rather the green in the water of money. They realize they want to copy that. And so what I got the impression of in the 2010s was that DC had to do their best to cobble together a plan to either compete with or at least continue on the same level with the Marvel films. Because I mean, I think they got Zack Snyder to do the Man of Steel, and aside from the fact that I do think Henry Cavill is actually a pretty good actor. He has a really good screen presence. I just feel like the film that he was offered to do was a subpar film, and it has a lot to do with Zack Snyder being a very shoddy filmmaker. I never, I mean, he has done a film I love because it's based on a comic or a graphic novel that I love, and so yeah, I mean, I did preface this beginning as I've never really been a fan of superheroes, and so I'm over here saying that I am endorsing Watchmen, and Watchmen is a subversion of the entire genre of superheroes. And I think that's another reason why I gravitate towards superhero stuff like The Boys, and because Watchmen and The Boys are both subversions of the genre, and I think that's sort of what attracts me to the genre. I mean, I'm not that interested in the genre being played straight because I do feel like if you're not careful exploring that idea of a superhero, you're and exploring it to its fullest extent, like just making it about like stereotypical comic book battles. I mean, that kind of thing can get kind of grating, and we're already starting to see that a little bit with how the Marvel Cinematic Universe has ultimately ended up shaping into. And I mean, up to no fault of their own. I mean, Marvel had to course correct immediately after the Jonathan Majors, ordeal, and so they had to course correct from making Kang the Conqueror the primary villain of this new phase to I guess Doctor Doom, but a variant of Doctor Doom that is portrayed by Robert Downey Jr. So I mean, it does kind of smack of desperation on Marvel's part, but it also smacks of they're trying to make the best call that benefits them and their business model, but also they know is interesting enough to spark a tiny bit of curiosity in the audience. And I think that's sort of what they're trying to do. I don't know if they'll be successful. We'll see. The Russo brothers have not really shown to be that successful outside of these movies. So I don't know how that's ultimately going to shape up. But regardless, um, they're going to be at the helm for, I think, Avengers, is it 4 or 5 now? So, ultimately that might prove lucrative for them. And you know what? Good on them for it. I don't have any issues with them necessarily. I don't. In this whole battle between DC and Marvel, Marvel has definitely done their best to actually try to write stuff that's kind of good. It's kind of entertaining. And, out of all the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, yeah, I mean, I'm there in the seat. I'm watching the Avengers. I'm there because of the cultural aspect of it, because we're all here watching something together. But I haven't seen anything come close to something like the Avengers Endgame, because I kind of got the impression that that was kind of like the last hurrah for films. Like, that was the last kind of everyone's going to be there to support this giant cultural touchstone. And after that, I mean, I don't think any films have quite done that. But I mean, a lot of that issue is part and parcel for the issue post pandemic. I mean, the post pandemic era, you know, has led to a sort of decline in movie going, but to a level that we hadn't seen in previous years. I mean, things are pretty fine at places like AMC and other big chain film movie theaters. So it's not that much of a. I mean, it's a big difference, but it's not. People are still going to the movie theaters. They're not all just. Every time I go to the theater, depending on what time of day. Usually later in the evening, there's everybody. Earlier in the day, it's less crowded, and I think that's part of the push of how they started moving the shifts down the day, because going to a movie in the morning is, I think, unheard of at AMC outside of like a few films that they know that they're hedging their bets on. So, but it's not like a normal thing. Like, you can't watch any movie. Although I think it's kind of been true forever, but I think it's just been getting worse as time's gone on. And I don't know if that has to do with them trying to leverage paying their employees and paying for keeping the concessions going, because they make a lot more of their money from the concessions, because ultimately the movie theaters are just designed to hold the movie, and then the people who make money off of the studio makes the box office return, but the actual profits for a movie theater come from concessions. So most of those are pretty expensive. So there's that to consider. But ultimately, and this is the kind of the main point, with these two films that are coming up, Fantastic Four representing the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then Superman being the biggest entry for James Gunn's tenure as DC Studios CEO. But the thing I noticed between these two films, unlike any film before, and this kind of gets back to the point I was making earlier, is about 12 years ago, when Zack Snyder kind of influenced or weaseled his way through the DC studios at that time. Regardless of whatever anyone thinks, the Man of Steel is all the DC films are very ugly because they're very dark, and not in terms of like storytelling darkness. Like things are kind of brutal and violent. No, we're talking like these things are just like visually dark. Like you can't see shit, and that is baffling to me. And there was a video published some years back. I forget exactly where on YouTube, or what channel did it, but there was a video of like, what if you color corrected Man of Steel and you put the brighter colors that belong in a Superman story, and how that would change and shift the tone to something that was more hopeful and optimistic. And they made the point that Superman should fly in bright blue skies, and I do agree that Superman as a concept should be a character that represents our optimism. You can get the story dark as fuck if you want. Superman is absolutely a character that can handle it, I think. At least, as a lay folk that, is not die hard into this, that, wants 100% one-to-one copy of whatever Superman thing has come out, or DC IP that, people want out there. Because for me, again, I'm coming at this as somebody who thinks of themselves as I think we'll call it a superhero fellow traveler. I'm not a superhero like fanatic, but I think if you're going to do it, especially now with how things have shifted around, I think this is the best way to do it. I think James Gunn knows what he's doing. He's a great filmmaker, and James Gunn thrives on making his stories very grounded and making them character driven and making them emotionally resonant. And I feel like he's the greatest. He's the best pick you could have for DC Studios. And I'm confident in his storytelling abilities. Now I don't know how much of that'll be hampered by idiots like David Zaslav or any of the other boneheaded executives that belong in a lot of these. They're kind of festering in these studio spaces. But beyond that, and we'll go over the trailer in a moment, but almost detail by detail. So if you guys are following along, I'll elucidate what exactly we'll be doing. But we'll also move on to the Fantastic Four trailer, and we'll kind of dive into a little bit of that. And then, yeah, after that, we'll kind of expand on some of the elements that I've noticed. So, we'll do a breakdown of each trailer, and then we'll dive into what this means for both franchises, or both studios going forward. Because Marvel Studios and DC Studios have traditionally competed against each other. And I think that there is not going to be a competition this time, at least not like it used to be. And I actually think that we're heading into an area that is a lot more interesting than I think any of us are giving credit for. So, without further ado, and we'll see if this gets me copyright struck, let's watch it. I think if I watch it without the audio, that helps. let's see. Now there was no new trailer for Fantastic Four Superman, I believe, at the Super Bowl today. And that's part of the reason why I was a little bit late. I said originally that I was going to be on at 7, but I ended up, tuning in at 8. So yeah, my team, the Chiefs, we lost, but it was really rough there for like 3 quarters. But um, you know, sometimes you lose some, sometimes you win some. But at the end of the day, I'll still support the Kansas City Chiefs. I've nothing against Philadelphia Eagles. Actually, both teams have won me money in the past. Fine with either outcome. I didn't bet anybody this time because everybody I tried to bet in previous years that I bet didn't want to bet me because they've lost against me in the past. So, yeah, no hard feelings, I guess. But anyway, we will go ahead and play the trailer. This will be without audio. It'll be just visual. But we'll go over everything else. So, we'll go by 10 seconds at a time. And we'll see what we can do. Okay. Now we're going into the Superman official teaser trailer. This is the one that was about 2 minutes and 20 seconds. So it begins in ice, like Antarctica ice. And so I guess this is them trying to say that this is the new, or somewhere close to the Fortress of Solitude, which I believe is Superman's lair, his Batcave, his home base. So he falls from the sky, and he ain't in good shape. But if you notice, between the shots in Antarctica, or the icy glacier stuff, and the shots in Metropolis, or what I assume is Metropolis, nothing is dark. Everything is visually vibrant. And I think the main color palette is probably blue. Because blue seems to be the color that pops a bit more. It's a combination of blue and yellow. But yeah, Superman is not doing too well. He's definitely seen better days. Let me see, from James Gunn. And we get a shot of the Day of the Planet. And we notice the clear lack of cubicles and more of like a police corral bullpen sort of thing. Although I don't see anything that reminds me of doesn't look like a crazy modern paper, but it kind of is. And we cut again, director of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. And this is the thing that's interesting. So they go from that sequence and then they cut to what is probably the Kent family farm in Smallville. And it's actually pretty nice. I mean, it's like a little like ranch house, lots of cattle outside. Looks pretty spacious. Nice, solid property. And then we see Pa Kent, who is like a man in his 60s, like a working class guy. So, that's what convinced me. It's not Kevin Costner. And I think the science fiction podcast with Damian Walter kind of picked up on this point. But yeah, I think that's the kind of important thing here, that it's just a guy. I think this guy's a character actor. But yeah, it feels more grounded, more emotionally resonant. And this is where you get the blues and yellows. Then you have the typical trailer this summer. And then Superman whistles for a something. We find out that this something is a doggo. And it begins. And the dog is Crypto, which, if people are familiar with comics, is Superman's dog. And I feel like there's a series of shots in this next part of the trailer that kind of relates to this idea. Kind of gives me the impression that we're going to see a lot of Superman's history kind of truncated, and but they'll get to a larger point after that. So I'm kind of curious what James Gunn has up his sleeve. But yeah, Superman comes in, saves a girl from something bad. Lex Luthor is running Luthor Corp, and he's not an old man. He's kind of a man in his 30s. And there's a kid waving or trying to set up a flag, which has the Superman symbol on it. It makes me curious. And then Superman has now achieved the point that was made in the Dark Knight, which is he has now lived long enough to see himself as the villain, and so they're throwing all kinds of crap at him. And there's some kind of thing at Stag Industries. Some of these characters I'm not sure about. I know Nathan Fillion is going to be playing a Green Lantern, if I'm not mistaken, and then there's another character who's flying. Another sort of couple of elements that are interesting here. Because you got Robot, the Force of Solitude, what seems to be the villain. And then you have part of the trailer that I find the most interesting. It's Boravian troops amassing at border. So this element of the trailer I find very interesting. Because you have this possibility that Superman might not show up to save these people, and that they have to save themselves. And I'm kind of wondering how that's going to actually unfold. And also, you have this idea of, well, whose border is it? And then I wonder if they're going to make a larger social issue with that. I wouldn't leave that on the table. Then you have Dev Ayesa from For All Mankind in this film, so I'm curious what role his character will play. But Lois and Superman definitely have a relationship that is going to be created through their interactions that should be interesting. Only in theaters, film for IMAX. So, again, throughout this trailer, everything is shot. You can see everything. Nothing is ugly. Everything looks pretty good. And that's what gives me the impression that this film is in the right hands with the right director. It also gives me the impression, and there's a comment right here that I think I will try to highlight, in a world of Homelanders, be Superman. I do think there's something to be said about The Boys and its portrayal of superheroes. I mean, Garth Ennis, the writer of the original of the Boys comics, his whole thing was that he created it to go over this idea of, if superheroes really existed, they'd all be like basically a bunch of assholes. And to some degree, I kind of agree with that point. Homelander is basically Dark Superman in a way. He's not a hero. He's definitely a villain, but some people think he's a hero, and that's kind of its own little thing. But from that you have something like Watchmen. And Watchmen, you have a character like Dr. Manhattan, who is the only character aside from maybe Ozymandias who is more of a I don't know what you want to call him, because he doesn't really have any superpowers either, but he's kind of the villain, even though the real villain of the story, you could argue, could be Rorschach. And some people don't agree with that point, but I think that's the point of what Alan Moore was trying to portray there. So this gets back to the larger idea that both Fantastic Four and Superman are both lighter and brighter. And I think that as an element is going to inform the next phases of the superhero franchise as we go on. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think that it's going to benefit both DC, it's going to benefit Marvel. Although I do find it a bit interesting, although not surprising, that as of right now, the number of views that we have for Superman, the official teaser trailer, is 54 million views. You contrast that with the official teaser for the Fantastic Four First Steps, and we have 25 million, but it only released 5 days ago. So we really can't be that, we can't beat them up too hard about that. But whatever the case is, in a couple of minutes, we'll dive into the trailer for Fantastic Four First Steps. So, some of the things I do like about it, beyond just the superficial things, I think the Superman trailer offers to me this idea that not only are we getting this reconstruction of superheroes as a concept, but Superman as well. Because ultimately, I think there was a big discussion. Everybody was kind of arguing about that. Um, you know, DC has moved beyond the original point of Superman, which was, it was like the motto they used to have during all of the, the shows, the comics. They would be, Superman stood for truth, justice, and the American way. And I remember seeing that they had moved away from that in the storytelling, and I think it became something like, Superman stands for now truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. I mean, that's fine, but ultimately, I think Superman at this day and age, with given what's all that's going on in the world, Superman is the epitome of what an American should be or what is. And I think that that's a bolder claim to make, and I think that that would be a stronger thesis for anyone's superhero story going forward, making it an antithetical to something like what we're seeing in the world today with the current administration in the White House. Now, regardless of what people think of how art should reflect whatever, ultimately, the best art, criticizes those in power. The worst art doesn't. The worst art just kind of is escapism or, pointless escapism. I think the best art is an actual escape, but it's not an escape for the people watching. It's an escape for people who are represented by the art. So at the end of the day, I mean, Superman is a fucking illegal immigrant. Came in with without any papers, without any documentation, and he basically comes to this country, you know, as a small baby who has no concept of where he's come from, and that's one of the lines I did really love in the Man of Steel movie, where Superman says that he's as corn fed, red blooded American as anybody else, and that's a point that I think the franchise should never lose, because ultimately that's what he fought for. That's truth, justice, and the American way, and I think they need to keep that as a concept. And to get back to this point, that Superman should always fly in bright skies. And yeah, I don't know why they moved away from that. Maybe because it wasn't as in vogue. Maybe because it just speaks to the what I regard as left wing cowardice, where they're unwilling to accept patriotism because they always think that it becomes nationalism, and I think that's the mistake that a lot of left wing media tends to make, is they tend to move away from what it is to be American. I think they end up having the other side define what it is to be American to the detriment of the left. So if I was them, I would not do that. Then again, I'm not that kind of a storyteller. I am someone different. But before we continue, ad time. The Fall YouTube channel is brought to you by Vega Aerospace. Vega Aerospace, in space. No one can hear you. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. So we're going to watch the Fantastic Four trailer. Now we're watching it without audio, so we don't get a copyright strike because YouTube is a fickle beast. But if you want to follow along with me, you can tune in to the Fantastic Four First Steps trailer, official teaser. This is directly from Marvel Entertainment. The trailer is 1 minute and 37 seconds. So let us begin. I'll start right now. So we open up, I think this is called the Baxter Building. So this is the building that's going to become Avengers Tower, I believe, later. But I mean, look at this. Kind of the same thing that we're going over earlier, but visually in the Superman trailer, you have colors that are basically built on the binary of blue and yellow, which I think is just a natural thing that happens. Some people criticize it, but I mean, what else are you going to do? Because you have, the cold color of blue and you have the warm color of yellow. That's just a general contrast. It's very easy. But here, you have the blue couch cushions, and then you have the yellow, looks to be like wallpaper maybe. But see, right here we have a lot of visuals that are very mid-century modern, very interesting, very intricate. And I mean, I love the design. This retro futuristic stuff works for me. It's always a favorite. Then you have Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, I believe. Now, before I continue any further, Fantastic Four has always been kind of a mixed bag with me. I mean, the stuff that I grew up with in the 2000s, it wasn't like great, but even then, it had a bright color palette. And then whatever that thing was that Josh Trank did, I never saw it, but that plays on the same exact bullshit I've been saying before. It was dark and ugly visually, but it was also dark and ugly storytelling wise. And it wasn't successful. Everybody's forgotten about it. So there you go. It just reinforces my point. But here we have the bright colors, vibrancy. They're coming out of an elevator and they're showing off everything. And I'm digging everything here. Mid-century modern look, 1960s, maybe 1950s. And we get a shot of the exterior of the Baxter Building, which looks pretty of the time. And then we get a fucking robot in the thing who is trying to sample some goods. And it's moments like this that I think are pretty good. Because this kind of signals to us that this is going to be more of a, interrelational thing. They bring it up at the end of the trailer, family. And that can be kind of a little bit of a crutch for some of these movies. I think it's because it's kind of an easy thing to fall back on. But I think in Fantastic Four, it can work as an idea. So I'm not too opposed to it in concept. But, I'm loving the uniforms, the blue and white. Well, I think a lot of this goes back to the 1960s comic books that the Fantastic Four originally started as. And I think that's part of the reason why the retro-futuristic look kind of fits it like a glove. And I would very much hope that they do everything they can to not move away from it. I think it's a very strong look. But the things I really love about this trailer is this. I mean, not only do I love the robot, but I love like this 1960s style. Like they're getting, there's a like reel, like a 35 or 16 millimeter film where they're kind of getting ready and suited up. And the suits look like something you would have seen in like Project Gemini in the mid 1960s. That was our kind of intermediary between Project Mercury and Project Apollo, because Project Mercury was the single-seater space platform that we were using to test, very basic, orbital mechanics, very basic astronaut shit. And Project Gemini was the thing that was the intermediary between the two. So it would take what we learned from Mercury and then advance those concepts to the next level. And actually, it's been argued that Project Gemini was actually better in terms of, just sheer design because you could do so much with it. It was a versatile platform, despite the initial versions of Project Gemini only being able to hold like two astronauts. And then the plan was to kind of generate Project Apollo as a 3-person spacecraft that would, instead of doing, because the original plan was to do one of 3 things. It was lunar orbit rendezvous, Earth orbit rendezvous, or direct ascent. And the one they ended up choosing, I believe, was Earth orbit rendezvous. So, that's a little space history for you. But I'm absolutely in love with these. Excuse me. I'm absolutely in love with these spacesuits because they feel of the era and they look very Project Gemini. And then you have the space launch, which I do think the rocket they're using in this kind of apes off of the Cosmos Strader from. Damn, what movie was that? I know more about the ship itself than I know about the movie it came from. But anyway, it kind of looks like the Cosmos Strader, and a lot of people have pointed out, especially Scott Manley and a few other people online, that having the rocket boosters be in the kind of outward fins is kind of dumb. I don't care. It looks fucking awesome. And again, that's something I enjoy because it has that old school look, and I'll never walk away from that old school look. It's awesome. But we kind of don't see exactly because the next scene over, because they're talking about how before they went up, you know, because the whole trailer he doesn't even show that he's kind of has these elastic elements, and maybe it would play a little bit more comical if they did up front like that. But I kind of like the way the trailer portrays itself, and then you have this element where the thing goes up to a TV set and sees himself before he turned into the thing. I think that's very interesting. And then you see Johnny with his flame powers, flame on. I don't know if they'll use the same line in there, but I'd be curious if they did. But that's fine. That works. Somebody was complaining about the CGI in this, and I think the CGI is pretty good. The thing that I'd be curious about, because they show a shot of New York City, and New York City is like the magnet for everything. So that's cool. But it's New York City in the 1960s, so it's kind of cooler. And there's a little bit of romance, between the two. Something coming from the sky that seems to be enveloping everything. Is that Galactus? Who knows? We'll find out. And I guess there's a fandom going on in the Fantastic Four world we see. Although I was reading some that said that it isn't the actual 1960s, it's just a world that is patterned after the 1960s, which just invites more questions from me. So we'll have to see how that turns out. And then they have the little car, fantastic car, which looks kind of cool. You got that. And then we have John Malkovich making an appearance, which is interesting to me. And then Galactus shows up. And then she says that they'll face this as a family. And there you have the end of it. The Fantastic Four. Also, it ends with a musical chorus that says Fantastic, which I think is also interesting. Presented in Fantastivision. Very interesting. Critical Drinker, a new beginning or a little too late? Little too late. Fantastic Four. Well, it's too early to say how these films will do, but I have a good feeling about how they'll perform. Strictly because I feel like we're entering an era that is the complete opposite of what we started with in the 2001, Um, on this channel, I'm probably going to focus on it a bit more than I would otherwise, because I see that right after not, because I kind of bifurcate my life experiences kind of on one event, and that event is September 11th, 2001. So to me, there was a very much a drastic difference between the pre 9/11 world and the post 9/11 world. So the pre 9/11 world was kind of filled with, this kind of pivot point, because post 19 the post Soviet era. So I was born in 1992. So the collapse of the Soviet Union led to an entire decade where the United States was the sole world superpower. And with that came this problem, which was that the United States had no enemies. And so in fiction, you'd have people dreaming up any little way to bring back the Russians. They did that for a couple of 007 movies. They had to do it for, they even started scapegoating the Koreans toward the end of that. Um, Even some of the books by, Tom Clancy, they started kind of dreaming up really crazy possible villains, and that was the Japanese radicals that would try to attack us for revenge for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that's in Dead of Honor. But either way, we were that a foe, and I feel like there was a lot of films created that kind of portrayed this idea that if you're a working professional, your life was pretty good, and so people would in that position would try to fight back against it. You would have people who were, for one reason or another, dissatisfied with their working class life. They would go to the office and they would feel like they were a cog in the machine. They were not people that felt like they mattered. And you saw this theme everywhere. You saw it in American Beauty, you saw it in Fight Club, you saw it in The Matrix for a tiny bit, you saw it in all these films. Office Space. So at that point in time, comfort was the enemy for the first time ever. And even since, a lot of us who struggle, or at least struggle at some point in our lives, we can't even fathom us ever being in a position to think that. But at that point in time, the movies that came out in the 90s were like insane. I mean, you had all kinds of different films being released that were kind of insane. I mean, the RLM guys did a revisit on the film Breakdown, and that they had a clip in there from the film Terminal Velocity, which gets, that trailer itself, you should watch it, is insane. So, I mean, you have a 1990s where things are a little more free and loose and kind of insane. I mean, you had a lot of great 90s films. You had Independence Day, you had Men in Black, you had Deep Impact. We'll let Armageddon slide for this. I mean, you had a lot of great films. But the thing is, those films are not lighter or darker. Those things are distilled and fine the way they are. They are the original, at least in my opinion. They are the there's nothing they're trying to fight back against. They're kind of just like doing their own thing with new ideas. And then when 9/11 happened, all of that was wiped away. Like you would never have a 90s film made in the 2000s or the 2010s because it would be seen as too optimistic, perhaps. Because I mean, Independence Day, they go out, they defeat the bad guys with a computer virus. Deep Impact, competent professionals go up, destroy the rock, Earth is saved. And Men in Black, competent professionals go out, do a job, save the world. That is the 90s. That was the 90s optimism that is gone in the 2000s. 2000s, you have moral ambiguity, you have moral gray, you have a lot of things that verge on villainy, straight villainy. Because, you have 24 come out, you have a lot of these darker and grittier stuff. Even the new Battlestar Galactica at that point in time, 2003 version, that had that element to it. I think born out of the 9/11 era. So for me, when I'm considering all this, there's absolutely a split between the optimism of the 90s and everything that came after it, at least in the last 20 years, which was more, grittier, more darker things, at least storytelling wise and thematically. But then you have our era, the 2010s or the 2020s. And you start seeing a giant shift away from little by little. I think this happens. I think Marvel has always been sort of optimistic in general, but even then, there was still a grit to it. It was never the sort of grit that you run into in the DC universe, which is always way more darker and way more grittier than anything Marvel would ever do, much to the detriment of DC, because then DC would be seen as too stuffy. And I think you kind of saw it in the Flash last year, where you have this attempt to be comedic. You have this attempt to try to do something that's at least a little bit more approachable from a modern audience. But then again, you also hit your wagon to an actor who's kind of weird and unapproachable, which is no fault of the movie itself, but it is the fault of the way the movie was presented. So, what can you do? I mean, that thing happened. That happens. But either way, the long and short of it, we have a 2020s where we're slowly but surely getting back to a film era that is a reconstruction of the genre. We have had our quintessential versions of the films, and then we've seen them be deconstructed, darker and more grittier. Because I do think that Endgame and Infinity War, these were fairly dark films thematically. I mean, literally, like half of everything, all life in the universe dies out, and it's not. It's actually a moment that actually happens, and it's not a moment that gets undercut by a silly joke. It's a moment they live with, and like 5 years go by, and they live in this world, and they opt to, instead of using the time travel to rewrite that, they use the time travel to instead, you know, basically not overdo anything that they just experienced. So actually, I thought that was a pretty good storytelling, device. It also doesn't violate time travel law and also preserves everything they've created to an extent. But that was the last go ahead for darkness. I mean, kind of, sort of, because Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is pretty damn dark and gritty, but it never loses its sort of edge that it usually had. And that's one of the things I think James Gunn is going to take to DC when he's, finally produced enough of the films there to kind of make a difference in how that um, franchise has been going. But that's why I'm optimistic with how both of these franchises are going at the moment. Because not only do you have a Marvel series that is, or a Marvel franchise that, is the biggest cinematic franchise in history, but is also having to live through several different eras. I mean, right now, I think we just finished up phase 5. We're going into phase 6 now. So, you know, that's a thing. So I think now is the right time to become more lighter and brighter and create things that are, maybe harkening back, nodding to the past, but also creating something that is distinct on its own. These are the reconstructions of both DC and Marvel as a franchise. And if anything, I feel like I'm pretty excited about the prospects of both. I think the future is bright for Marvel. I think the future is bright for DC. As long as they decide not to forego this moment in favor of cheap imitations of things that I think even they recognize would be somewhat uncouth. But let's take a minute to dive into what is expected from the Marvel Cinematic Universe at the moment. Because for those of you unaware, we are now 6 phases into a possibly endless phase story. According to this, Marvel Cinematic Universe phases started with the Infinity Saga, and this takes up the first 3 phases. Phase 1, 2008 to 2012. So that ended with the first Avengers movie, and then Phase 2, 2013 to 2015. I believe that was the Age of Ultron, is where that ended things. And then Phase 3 was 2016 to 2019. So this was ultimately what ended with Infinity War and Endgame. And then we moved on to the Multiverse Saga, where Phase 4 is 2021 to 2022. Phase 5, 2023 to 2025. And then Phase 6, 2025 to 2027. So I don't know what they're planning to do with the next phase or what this next saga coming up will be. Although I hope they decide to figure that out soon. And then there's countless TV shows that they've developed over the years. I haven't watched all of them. I don't plan to watch all of them. But according to this, Phase 6 consists of the Fantastic Four. So Phase 5 is fucking humongous. So Phase 5 started with Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and then continued with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, The Marvels, Deadpool and Wolverine, Captain America Brave New World is the next one in the series, as well as Thunderbolts. Both films will be out this year, as well as Fantastic Four First Steps, which is the beginning of Phase 6, which will be followed by Avengers Doomsday in 2026, an untitled fourth Spider-Man film in 2026, and conclude with Avengers Secret Wars in 2027. Which I find kind of fascinating considering that everything started in 2008 and then this will be over in 2027. So it's an almost 20-year project. And yet, that's where we find ourselves. Well, it's quite interesting. But beyond that, that's what we have to expect from what's coming from Marvel. But when we move things to the DC universe and how things are going there, we have, according to the elements on Wikipedia, that the DC universe is a soft reboot of the previous franchise, the DC Extended Universe. So I find that quite interesting. And the creators of this new studio, DC Studios, is James Gunn and Peter Safran, as most people are probably already aware. And the difference here is that there'll be some trade-off. So, I mean, I enjoyed the Suicide Squad James Gunn made. I have not seen Peacemaker, but I plan to. People let me know what Creature Commandos is about. I'm kind of curious. But unlike DC or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the DC Universe is broken into chapters. Well, I find that to be particularly interesting. So, the DC Universe starts with James Gunn's Superman and then continues on with Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. So, this is chapter 1, Gods and Monsters. So, I guess it's broken up into chapters, like I said. Clayface, 2026. The Authority, Brave and the Bold, Swamp Thing, and that's not stated, but it is directed by James Mangold, so that's interesting. And then there's other films they have planned. Untitled Teen Titans film, Untitled Bane and Deathstroke film. Sergeant Rock. Hmm. Well, I don't know how he plans to do it, but I can only assume that it'll be interesting to see when it's all shaped up. But yeah, I see all of this, and I get the impression that things are not going to be the way they were under Zack Snyder's reign as the de facto chief of DC Studios, or the DC Extended Universe. Because under that whole, whatever you want to call it, kind of a disaster. It ran for 10 years, as you all are probably aware, and I think was mostly filled with failures. Yeah, it's kind of crazy that even happened. Ah, shit. Well, there you go. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that what we're seeing with Fantastic Four and Superman is emblematic of what I think the franchises are both going to do moving forward, which is attribute their success to being things that are lighter and softer, that are reconstructions of the genre as opposed to deconstructions that we've been seeing for the last few years. And I think this is a much needed change of pace from how things have been, and I think it'll benefit both franchises immensely to do so. But time will tell. So I don't know if I'll do reviews on any of these. I do plan to explore a little bit of it. I mean, there's a thought in my mind that I might do reviews on Wednesdays. Like I'll do a short little clip and then I'll clip it out and post it on my Wednesday short video schedule. But we'll see. I'm planning to do a video essay post on February 24th. That'll be exploring the alternate history subgenre of science fiction, and to be fair, fantasy and horror, because I think you can do that in all three. And then we'll be keeping our lives on Friday nights. Um, didn't do it last time because of my wedding and a bunch of other little things that kind of stalled me out. But Sunday nights like this, we won't do that as often. Um, we were trying to take advantage of the Super Bowl post uh, viewership that was available. So we'll see how that all shakes out as well. But in general, I think in my own writing, and this is connecting it back to world building, I think the best worlds you can create are worlds that are aspirational, that kind of push for something better than what we have. Not that dystopias can't as well. Usually dystopias are created to be more of a cautionary tale on potential worlds that have been created out of ideas we don't like. But I think there should be more than enough space to do the opposite. I think in a time like this, it is necessary to do so. And I think that I'm going to do my best to do so as the weeks, months, and years roll on. But whatever the case is, coming up on our hour, and we try to keep these episodes to about an hour long. So I hope that I've said at least a couple of things that piqued your interest, or at least kind of get you thinking. And I hope that you tune back in for our next episode, which will be on Friday on the live stream schedule. Again, we won't be releasing a actual first episode of our video essay series until the 24th, but the podcast show and all that will be starting up again beginning of March. So keep that in mind, and I hope you join us for that. But until next time, don't forget your towel, don't panic, and until next time, so long, and thanks for all the fish.